What's up, designers, and welcome back to Rempton Games. On this channel and on my blog, I've touched on a lot of different areas of game design, but one that I haven't talked about much is character design, and few games live or die based on the quality of their characters as much as Pokemon, and possibly Sonic the Hedgehog. For this video, I want to take an in-depth look at Pokemon designs to truly see how they've evolved over these past 23 years. To do so, I've not only personally analyzed their designs, but also read numerous interviews regarding the inspiration behind various Pokemon and the design process behind them, as well as how technical limitations have influenced these designs over the past generations. Of course, before we can really discuss how Pokemon designs have changed over time, we need a baseline to compare them to. This baseline, of course, is Generation 1. Love 'em or hate 'em, the original 151 Pokemon formed the foundation of the entire Pokemon franchise, and for millions of players, these Pokemon influenced their idea of what a Pokemon is supposed to look like. Before I dive into the details, I want to mention that Pokemon has never really had a strongly defined art style. Ever since the beginning, there's been a wide variety of different monsters in different styles, so for these videos I'm mostly going to be focusing on general trends. Not every trend is going to affect every single Pokemon in a generation, and there are always going to be counterexamples, but I think looking at these general trends can give you a good idea of how Pokemon designs have changed from generation to generation. That being said, there are a number of factors that separate the original 151 Pokemon from those that came after. I think the main three things that influenced these designs were the mindsets of the developers at the time, the technical limitations of the Game Boy, and the smaller size of the initial design team. The first thing to remember when talking about the designs of the Gen 1 Pokemon is that the designers were not intending to design Pokemon as we know them today. The word Pokemon has a lot of connotations and baggage that have come from 20 years of anime, video games, merchandise, and other media that didn't really exist when the original 151 Pokemon were being designed. Instead of trying to design Pokemon, the designers were really just trying to design monsters similar to those you would find in any contemporary JRPG from that time. For a great example of this, you can look at the Pokemon Rattata and Zubat. Rats and bats, or Skeevers and Keese, are incredibly common early game enemies in a lot of JRPGs, and it only makes sense that if you're designing monsters for these sorts of games, you would want to design a rat and a bat enemy that players would encounter early on in the game. This mindset also guided the broader designs of the early Pokemon, which, unlike later generations, were primarily designed to look tough, due to the focus on creature combat. Gen 1 certainly has a higher proportion of tough-looking creatures, with even smaller and weaker monsters such as Pidgey and Nidoran designed to look intimidating. This isn't to say that Generation 1 doesn't have any cute-looking Pokemon, because it certainly does. However, based on interviews, it seems like the cute Pokemon were mostly added later in development and were more of an afterthought. According to Ken Sugimori, the original games focused on fighting, trading, and collecting. While tough-looking Pokemon may excel at the fighting portion, it was decided later on in development that having a wider range of different types of creatures, including cute ones, would make it more exciting to trade and collect with your friends. Regarding the general designs of the Pokemon themselves, they draw from a wide range of different inspirations, running from real-world animals and plants, to mythology, to objects, to concepts, to even being based on specific people. With so many different sources to draw from, it can be hard to spot the similarities, but there are a number of trends that you can notice. The first thing to notice is their color palettes. While Pokemon come in a wide variety of different colors, early Pokemon themselves were not very colorful. If you look at early Pokemon as a whole, most of them have very simple color schemes, with one main color and usually a lighter or darker color as an accent. This is mainly due to the technical limitations of the original Game Boy, which was not a color console. Because early sprites could only be shown in a handful of shades of gray, it didn't make too much sense to have many colors on the same Pokemon. This influenced the color schemes of these Pokemon, but it also influenced their designs in other ways as well. Because of the lack of color, these original Pokemon designs relied on contrast to make their designs interesting and recognizable. For For this reason, many Pokemon were given additional design details in a contrasting color to help add variety to their designs and make them stand out from one another. An example of this is the dark stripes on Pikachu's back, which were added to make it more interesting to look at from the back, but this also applies to the nearly 40 Pokemon that have light tummies that contrast with the rest of their color scheme. Technical limitations also limited how complex these early designs could be, because they'd have to be represented in low-resolution sprites. The designers had to walk a fine line between adding enough detail to make their designs distinctive, while making it simple enough it could be represented as a sprite. However, despite their best efforts, a lot of Pokemon still ended up requiring unusual proportions or strange poses to show the whole Pokemon. That just looks uncomfortable. One final thing to note about the general designs of Gen 1 Pokemon is it seems that the most important aspect of the Pokemon was its appearance. What I mean by this was that Gen 1 was made with the goal of having an interesting and diverse set of monsters to collect and trade, and things like competitive balance didn't really seem to factor into it. Gen 1 was notoriously unbalanced, and a lot of later generations would put much more focus on balancing the competitive abilities of their Pokemon. The same can be said for the type system. It seems that Pokemon were generally given whatever types would make the most sense for their designs, with little regard for balancing the different types. This led to a lot of low-hanging fruit typing, such as having an overabundance of poison, water, and normal types, and oddities such as having no pure rock types and Tangela being the only pure grass type Pokemon in the whole generation. In addition to these general design trends, the Gen 1 Pokemon had a number of very specific traits that were repeated over and over on different Pokemon. This is most likely due to the smaller size of the design team, which allowed individual designers unique styles to show through, resulting in these repeating design features. For a good example of what I'm talking about, let's take a look at the eyes of the Gen 1 Pokemon. While Pokemon has always had a variety of different eye styles, by and large, Generation 1 uses a handful of repeating eye shapes on the vast majority of its Pokemon. The first are what I like to refer to as angry anime eyes, and these can be seen on Pokemon such as Charizard, Blastoise, Arcanine, and Mewtwo. These eyes are immediately recognizable. Made up of lines that slant towards each other, mostly white with some dark pupils. This style of eyes was very common in anime in the 80s and 90s and wouldn't look at all out of place in something like Dragon Ball Z. These eyes are incredibly common among the original 151, making up, with my quick count, about 1/3 of all Pokemon in this generation. From Gyarados to Tauros to Nidoking, the list just goes on and on. However, aside from the original 151, this style of eyes drops off exponentially in future generations. It's used sparingly in Gens 2 and 3, and barely at all after that point. Because of this, the angry anime eyes is one of those features that really defines the look of these Generation 1 Pokemon. However, not all Pokemon in Gen 1 use this eye style. There are a number of other common repeating eye motifs, such as the cute anime eyes, which you can see on Pokemon like Charmander and Mew, circular eyes with small dot pupils, which can be seen on Pokemon like Magneton and Shellder, and mystical eyes, for lack of a better term, which you can see on Pokemon like Vulpix, the Evolutions, and Dragonair. I know I'm spending a lot of time talking about the eyes, but that's only because eyes are one of the most important parts of any character's design, and this definitely applies to Pokemon as well. To quote the cliche, the eyes are the windows to the soul, and just by looking at a character's eyes, you can tell a lot about that character's personality. For example, angry anime eyes show you that this is a formidable monster that you don't want to mess with in battle, while cute anime eyes tell you that this is a friendly creature that you can hang out with. Mystical eyes, which are some of my favorites, show you that this Pokemon is mysterious and otherworldly, while the big round eyes tell you that the Pokemon is kinda dumb, I guess? These eyes not only help show the personalities of these Pokemon, but having a more limited range of different eye designs make the whole generation look very cohesive. However, their eyes are far from the only repeated trait that can be found on a number of different Pokemon. This can easily be seen by simply looking at these Pokemon's hands and feet. There's an extremely common motif among Gen 1 Pokemon of having very similar looking clawed hands and feet. For hands, for example, simply look at Blastoise, Nidoking, Rhydon, Golem, or Kangaskhan. They all have 3 claws on their hands arranged in a very similar way. Many of those examples I just gave also show the same thing on their feet. While the hands are almost always 3 claws, the feet do have a little bit more variety, with 2 and 4 clawed variations. Hitmonlee has 3 claws on his feet, Slowbro only has 2, and some Pokemon, such as Lickitung, only have 1. However, the single-clawed variation will actually become more popular in later generations. In addition, with the apparent exception of duck-based Pokemon, all birds in Generation 1 have the exact same feet. Another trait that's widely repeated among Generation 1 Pokemon is their ears. Basically, their ears are triangles. Sandshrew, triangle ears. Jigglypuff, triangle ears. Hypno? You can bet yourself that boy's got himself a big heapin' helpin' of triangle ears. They even pop up in places where they don't really make sense. Blastoise is a turtle with triangle ears. Why is it so hard to try to figure out what Venusaur is supposed to be? Probably because he's a frog with triangle ears. Even this is far from an exhaustive list, and there are a number of features that appear on a smaller number of creatures, such as swirls, these head crest thingies, and even Pokemon with lips, which is one trend that I don't think anybody really misses. I'm not gonna dig into every repeated trait, but I think you get the idea. Gen 1 designs remain some of the most iconic Pokemon designs of all time, from Pikachu and Jigglypuff to Charizard, Gengar, and Mewtwo. With its mix of cute and tough-looking designs, it's certainly left a strong impression on millions of fans. However, now that there are 8 generations of Pokemon, we've only scratched the surface of their designs, and there's a lot more to look forward to in future episodes. What's up, designers, and welcome back to Rempton Games. Today, I'm super excited to take a look at the designs of Pokemon from Generation 2 and see how they've changed since Generation 1. For this episode, we're going to be taking a look at several different things that influence the designs of Generation 2 Pokemon. First, we're going to take a look at some general design trends that have to do with the themes of these games. Second, we're going to take a look at how new technology and mechanics have influenced these designs. Third, I want to take a closer look at the designs of legendary Pokemon, and we'll finish out with a comparison of Pokemon that serve similar roles in Generations 1 and 2. Without further ado, let's get into it. Let's start by looking at some of the general themes and trends of Generation 2. Generation 2 is kind of unique among Pokemon games in that it's designed as a direct sequel to the previous generation. Gen 1 and Gen 2 are very closely linked, and this can clearly be seen by looking at the games themselves. Gen 2 takes place 3 years after Red and Green, which matches the amount of time that has passed in the real world between the releases of these 2 games. In Gold and Silver, you can see many characters from the original games that have grown and changed over the intervening years. In addition, Gold and Silver are the only games other than remakes that allow the player to explore multiple regions in a single game. In this case, you can explore the new region, Johto, but you can also go back to the Kanto region that you explored in Red and Green. This close relationship between the 2 generations actually extends even further to their early development. Gold and Silver were originally developed under the name Pokemon 2, and as can be seen from a 1997 demo which was shown at Nintendo's Space World convention, they were originally developed in a modified version of the Red and Green engine. Based on this evidence, it seems pretty clear that Gold and Silver were under development while Gen 1 was still going on. They probably began after Red and Green were released in Japan, but before the release of Pokemon Blue and Yellow, which were Gen 1's enhanced versions. The close relationship between these 2 generations also extends to the Pokemon themselves. For example, many Generation 2 Pokemon are direct evolutionary relatives of Pokemon from Generation 1. For example, you can look at Slowking and Blossom. Many original Pokemon also likely have their roots in Generation 1. One example that we know for sure is Gaoon, a Pokemon that was cut from Generation 1, but later got added to Generation 2 as Tyranitar. Despite these close ties, however, there are a number of things that make Generation 2 Pokemon distinct from their predecessors. One of the biggest and most pervasive was a narrowing and refining of the definition of what a Pokemon could be. In Generation 1, Pokemon came from a wide range of sources and could basically be anything. They could have multiple heads or bodies, they could be based off of inanimate objects or concepts, or be very humanoid. In Generation 2, this is no longer the case. In Generation 2, pretty much all of the newly introduced Pokemon families have very clear animal, plant, or mythological inspirations. Mareep is a sheep, Sudowoodo is a petrified tree, and so on. While there are a few odd outliers like Unknown and Wobbuffet that have more unusual inspirations for their designs, for the most part, this generation has chosen to have very natural inspirations for its Pokemon. I think there are a few reasons for this. The first one is a cultural reason. When Generation 1 was released, nobody had any preconceived notions about what a Pokemon was supposed to be. By the time Generation 2 rolls around, Pokemon had been around for a couple of years, and the word Pokemon had gathered some specific connotations. While Pokemon were originally just designed as monsters, due to the way that they were portrayed in media such as the very popular anime series, people began to think of them more as animals, with the ecosystem, predator-prey relationships, things like that. While there was certainly some of this in Gen 1, I think the design philosophy shifted towards Pokemon that would seem to make sense in a more natural environment. Another reason for this, however, is due to the themes of the Johto region. In the first games, players explore the Kanto region, which is based on a region of Japan with the same name. The Kanto region is the most industrialized and urbanized region of Japan, and is home to the Tokyo metropolitan area. Similarly, the Kanto region in Pokemon Red and Green show a modern, technologically advanced Pokemon world. Perhaps because of this, many of the original 151 Pokemon have urban influences in their designs. Coughing and Muck, for example, are based on urban pollution, whereas Pokemon like Porygon and Mewtwo show the influence of advanced technology. In contrast to this, the Johto region, which is the new region introduced in these games, is based on the Kansai region of Japan, which is more known for being a center of history and culture, which fits the themes of the Johto region. The Johto region is much more rural than the highly urbanized Kanto, and is much more influenced by traditional Japanese culture. This can be seen by looking at things such as the Brass Tower or the Ilex Forest Shrine. Because of this rural Japanese influence, many of the Pokemon seem to take inspiration from animals and plants that would make sense in a temperate forest environment. Pokemon like Stantler, Noctowl, Heracross, Ledybot, and Pineco all fit this description. In addition to this trend away from some of the more unusual designs of Generation 1, Generation 2 has a general trend towards Pokemon that look more designed, for lack of a better word. While Pokemon in Generation 1 have a rough, jagged look to them, the designs of Generation 2 look somewhat more deliberate. I think the best way to show this is by comparison, and I think a good comparison for this would be Electabuzz with Ampharos. Both are electric-type Pokemon with primarily yellow bodies and black accents. While the black stripes on Electabuzz's body were definitely a design decision, the way they're drawn, they're meant to look like a natural part of Electabuzz's fur. Compare this to Ampharos's rings, which seem to be much more deliberately placed. As a matter of fact, rings and loops seem to be a common design motif among Generation 2 Pokemon, and can be seen on Pokemon such as Furret, Umbreon, and Ursaring. Another way to see this would be to look at the birds that appear early on in these different games. In Generation 1, you have the Pidgey line, which seem to be based on relatively basic, somewhat realistic-looking birds. Compare this to Hoot Hoot and Noctowl, which fill a very similar role in Generation 2, and you can immediately see the differences. The newer designs seem much less natural, especially with the clock-like design on Hoot Hoot's face, and they overall have a smoother, more stylized look. Now that we've looked at how general trends and themes have affected the designs of Generation 2 Pokemon, let's take a look at how new technology and mechanics influence these designs. Generation 2 introduced a number of gameplay features that would go on to become staples of the series. This includes 2 new types, Dark and Steel, that were added to help balance the battle system. The introduction of these 2 new types means that new Pokemon had to be designed to fill these types. some Pokemon were changed from their original typing to fit this role, such as Umbreon, which was originally designed to be a poison type. Other Pokemon seem like they were designed specifically to fill out these new types, such as Skarmory, which looks like it was deliberately designed from the ground up to be a steel type. Another new mechanic added in Generation 2 was gender. However, male and female Nidoran are still treated as different species for some reason. However, with the addition of Pokemon gender came Pokemon breeding, and many older Pokemon were given new baby forms to show off this new mechanic. These baby Pokemon can only be obtained by breeding their older, more evolved forms, and basically look like cuter, more simplified versions of the original Pokemon. When it comes to specific repetitive design traits, Generation 2 is much less defined by this than Generation 1 was. For example, while it still does have some of the same eye styles that were used in Generation 1, they're used much less frequently. Angry anime eyes, for example, are mostly reserved for Pokemon like Houndoom, Tyranitar, and Ursaring that are designed to be particularly aggressive and threatening. In general, Generation 2 has a much wider variety of eye styles, and is much more open to experimental styles such as Chinchou, Xatu, and Dunsparce. However, if I had to choose a style that seemed the most common, it would be a dark circle or oval with a small sparkle of light in it. This type of eye was used a few times in Generation 1, most notably for Pikachu, and is used several times in Generation 2. Other Gen 1 features, such as the 3-clawed hands and feet, are also much less likely to be seen in Generation 2. Gen 2 has more of a trend towards nub-like arms with little or no definition. Technical limitations have also had an effect on these Pokemon designs. While Red and Green came out for the original Game Boy, Pokemon Gold and Silver came out on the Game Boy Color. While this didn't really change design limitations in terms of sprite size or complexity, it did give the designers much more freedom in terms of color. Pokemon in Generation 1 tended to have very simple color schemes with one main color and a lighter or darker accent color to provide additional detail. Gen 2 Pokemon, in contrast, tend to have a color scheme that consists of 3 or 4 main colors. This is largely due to the graphical abilities of the Game Boy Color. However, while it is able to show color, its graphical abilities are still pretty limited. Each sprite was limited to a single palette of 4 colors, and one of those colors was required to be transparent. In order to get around this, Pokemon battles are always shown on a white background, so this transparent color can be used as white. This limited the sprites to only having a few main colors, but it still allowed the designers to use color in a way they never could before. One way that the Gold and Silver designers expressed this newfound freedom was by designing Pokemon with vibrant complementary colors, or by simply designing more colorful Pokemon overall. Good examples of this include Ariados, Togepi, Xatu, and of course, Ho-Oh. Speaking of Ho-Oh, that brings us to our next section, the design of legendary Pokemon. From developer interviews and design documents, it's pretty clear that the concept of legendary Pokemon, or something similar to them, had been around since the very early stages of Pokemon development. However, even after Red and Green's release, I don't think the concept of legendary Pokemon had really been fully fleshed out yet. When it came to these early games, legendary Pokemon basically just boiled down to being very powerful and hard to catch. In Gold and Silver, however, the concept of legendary Pokemon evolves somewhat. First, we actually get to hear legends about these Pokemon, specifically the story of Ho-Oh in the Burned Tower. For those who aren't familiar, this tells the story of 3 Pokemon who died when lightning struck what is now called the Burned Tower. Ho-Oh, who used to roost in the tower, revived these 3 Pokemon, which were widely believed to have been the original evolutions, and they became the legendary beast trio Entei, Raikou, and Suicune. I believe that giving these legendary Pokemon this backstory helps add a sense of power and mystique, but their designs also reflect this, especially when compared to the legendary Pokemon in Generation 1. While I think that Mewtwo's design does a good job of conveying its role as a powerful mutant alien that's not to be messed with, I think that the legendary birds look relatively ordinary. Sort of like what you'd get if you evolved Pidgey with elemental stones. Compared to that, The legendaries in Gold and Silver, I think, do a good job of conveying their legendariness, because they don't look like anything else in the generation. No other Pokemon up to this point has the same level of detail and complexity in their designs as the legendary beasts, and this sets a real trend for the designs of legendary Pokemon going forward. Finally, I think a good way to really see how the designs have changed from the previous generation is to do a side-by-side comparison of Pokemon that serve similar roles in these games. The Pokemon series has a habit of repeating similar types of Pokemon that fill the same niche in the games, and I believe that by comparing these similar Pokemon, you can get a good apples-to-apples comparison of their designs. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Rempton Games. Today, it's time for part 3 of my ongoing Evolution of Pokemon design series, where I'm going to be taking a look at the designs of Pokemon from Generation 3 and how they've changed from previous generations. To do so, I'm going to be taking a look at the background of these games, look at some of the general design trends among these Pokemon, see how technological and mechanical changes have influenced these designs, and finally, do a direct comparison with Pokemon from previous generations. Without further ado, let's get into it. Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire were the third pair of main series games in the Pokemon series, but when these games were originally in development, it was never planned to have 3 different generations, much less 8. During early Pokemon development, they only planned on releasing the original games and maybe a sequel. That's it. However, Generations 1 and 2 were both huge hits, so it was decided to keep going with the series. Unfortunately, by the time Generation 3 came around, the Pokemon trend was starting to die down, and many believed the fad to be over. For these reasons, the developers were determined to make a successful game. If this failed, it could spell the end of the Pokemon series. It's fair to say that they succeeded. While Generation 3 didn't reach the massive heights of popularity that Generation 1 and 2 did, it was still incredibly successful, and they became the highest selling games on the Game Boy Advance. These games weren't without their criticism, however. One of the biggest disappointments with Generation 3 was the inability to trade and transfer Pokemon from Generations 1 and 2. This was due to the Game Boy Advance's inability to communicate with the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Because of this, these games feel much more disconnected from previous games in the series. While Gold and Silver were basically direct sequels to Red and Green, Ruby and Sapphire are more like a soft reboot with very little connection to the previous games. These games take place in the brand new Hoenn region, and you're unable to visit the previous regions of Johto and Kanto, and there's very little reference to the characters, story, or locations from the previous games. This soft reboot mentality can also be seen when looking at the Pokemon themselves. While Generation 2 has a large number of Pokemon that are direct evolutionary relatives of Pokemon from Generation 1, making up around 20% of all of the new Pokemon introduced, Generation 3 only has 2 new pre-evolutions, Wynaut and Azurill, and no new evolutions of old Pokemon. Because these games rely less on previous generations, they also added more brand new Pokemon, adding 135 new Pokemon to bring the total up to 386. That being said, many Pokemon in Generation 3 could be seen as parallels to Generation 1 Pokemon. I'm not referring to Pokemon that fill the same niche that can be found in every Pokemon game, but Pokemon that have very specific similarities to previous Pokemon. Examples include Lairon and Aggron, which are very reminiscent of Rhyhorn and Rhydon, and Feebas and Milotic, who have strong parallels to Magikarp and Gyarados. You could also say that the Wurmple line is sort of a combination of the Caterpie and Weedle lines. The Hoenn region, where these new games are set, is much different from the previous Kanto and Johto regions. While those regions were connected together and represented a small part of a much larger continent, the Hoenn region is a self-contained island surrounded by ocean and smaller islands. It is also much more tropical than previous regions, and the ocean makes up a large part of the explorable space of the region. In general, Generation 3 is a very mixed bag of designs. It has some very simple, almost minimalistic designs with Pokemon like Surskit, Skitty, Gardevoir, Luvdisc, and Shuppet. Many of these minimalistic designs are also based off of simple spheres or oval shapes, such as Spheal, Wailmer, Swalot, and Cascoon. However, these games also have some very complex designs, more complex than the design would have been in previous generations. Examples of this include Glalie, Huntail, Armaldo, and Solrock. However, despite the wide range of designs available in this generation, there are still a number of major themes that guide the designs. One of the main themes of the Hoenn region is balance, specifically balance between man and nature. The people of the Hoenn region are very in tune with nature and generally try to live in harmony with it. The people of Four Tree City, for example, live in the trees, and the people of Pacificlog Town live on top of a colony of Corsola. This theme goes so deeply that even the shape of the region itself sort of resembles a yin-yang symbol, which is a symbol of balance. The evil teams of these games, Team Aqua and Team Magma, are evil because they're trying to disrupt the balance of nature, either by drying up the ocean to create more land, or flooding the land to create more ocean. This connects strongly with another sub-theme of these games, which is weather and climate. These games are the first in the series to have weather appear on the overworld, including sandstorms, rain, and heavy sunlight. They also added a new form of weather, hail. One of the places you'll fight the evil teams is at a weather institute, and afterwards they'll give you the Pokemon Cast Form, which changes form based on the current weather. The three cover legendaries of this generation, Kyogre, Groudon, and Rayquaza, all have weather-based abilities in battle. In addition, Hoenn has a much wider range of climates than either the Kanto or Johto regions, featuring mountains and volcanoes, beaches, oceans, deserts, temperate forests, and rainforests. Speaking of legendary Pokemon, I believe that the designs of the legendary Pokemon in this generation also support these themes in another way. While it may be a bit of a stretch, the designs of all of these legendary Pokemon seem to have a mix of organic and technological features. Kyogre, Groudon, and Rayquaza all have these technological, almost circuit-like designs on their body, and Rayquaza in particular has fins that look like they belong on some sort of rocket or spacecraft. Latios and Latios are dragons, but their designs also resemble modern aircraft. Finally, the Regis have a very artificial look to them, which makes sense given that they're not natural Pokemon and were created by Regigigas. These legendary Pokemon also represent a further refinement of the concept of what a legendary Pokemon can be. Specifically, Kyogre, Groudon, and Rayquaza are all embodiments of nature, the earth, the oceans, and the sky, and their power is so immense that it can reshape the entire surface of the planet. These are the first legendary Pokemon that are basically embodiments of abstract concepts, a trend that will continue in future generations, and their pure power far surpasses anything that we have seen up until this point. Now that we've looked at some of the major themes of these games, let's take a look at some of the general design trends among these Pokemon. As I mentioned earlier, Gen 3 Pokemon are a bit of a mixed bag. While Generation 2 had a much more refined idea of what a Pokemon could be, and was mostly made up of elemental animals and plants, a Pokemon in Generation 3 can be pretty much anything. Most are still animal-based, but many are humanoid, such as Blaziken, Gardevoir, Hariyama, and Medicham. Some are based on inanimate objects like Claydol, Bayonet, and Chimecho, or have less specific, monstrous designs, such as Exploud, Duskull, Swalot, and Metagross. One specific thing I should note about the object-inspired Pokemon of this generation. While Gen 1 object-based Pokemon like Voltorb and Magnemite basically just look like the objects that they're based on, the designs in Generation 3 are a bit more subtle. They definitely take inspiration from specific objects like wind chimes or a possessed doll, but don't directly copy the appearance of those objects. This is relatively unique to this generation, as object-based Pokemon in other generations tend to more closely resemble their inspirations. One design theme carried over from Generation 2 is the usage of circles and rings as a design motif, and this trend is even more widespread in Generation 3. Adding rings seems to be a go-to way of filling blank spaces in the design, as can be seen on Pokemon such as Dustox, Makuhita, Camerupt, Claydol, and Huntail. Circular spots seem to fill a similar purpose, and can be seen on Wailord, Spheal, Cradily, Medicham, Lairon, and Shroomish. Aside from these general rings and circles, there are some more specific uses of these motifs that are common on Gen 3 Pokemon. Many Pokemon, for example, have whole or partial circles around their eyes. Examples include Sceptile, Seedot, Slackoth, Aeron, Numel, Cacnea, Baltoy, and Kyogre. This could also be expanded to include the mask-like designs around the eyes of Zigzagoon, Nuzleaf, and Ludicolo. Another specific usage of these rings is thin, usually single-pixel bands that go around part of the Pokemon's body. This can be seen on Blaziken's arms, Seedot's hat, Nuzleaf's legs, Shedinja's shell, Walreign's neck, and Dusclops' everything. Rings and circles aren't the only design motifs used in this generation. Zigzags are also very common, and can be found on Pokemon such as Ludicolo, Carvanha, Trapinch, Zangoose, Crawdaunt, Wishcash, Kecleon, and of course, Zigzagoon. In Generation 1, many Pokemon had rough, uneven, organic shapes and jagged, natural-looking fur. Generation 2, for the most part, switched this up for smoother, more deliberate-looking designs. Generation 3 somewhat combines these approaches. It has a good mix between smooth, minimalistic Pokemon with some jagged, uneven designs. However, the jagged designs in Generation 3 differ somewhat from those found in Generation 1. In Generation 1, rough fur was generally added to furry Pokemon as a form of realism, and provided a number of different textures. In Gen 3, the jagged edges of the fur seem much more exaggerated and deliberate. For example, compare the rough, natural-looking fur of Arcanine with the much more exaggerated look of Absol. Also, Generation 3 rarely uses the asymmetrical, organic shapes of Gen 1. Compare the rough, knobbly claws of Kingler with the smoother, more symmetrical shapes of Crawdaunt. The exception is on more rocky-looking Pokemon like Beldum, Regirock, and Solrock. Aside from these general design trends, new technology also influenced the designs of these Pokemon. The jump from the Game Boy Color to the Game Boy Advance was a major technological upgrade that greatly improved the visual capabilities of these games, and basically eliminated any limitations regarding color. Sprites can now have much more than 4 colors on a single sprite, and there's a much wider range of colors available. This allows for overall more colorful Pokemon. Beautifly, for example, has 5 major colors, which would have been impossible previously. However, there really aren't that many examples of this, as Pokemon rarely have more than 4 major colors. That being said, the additional colors can still make the sprites look more appealing because they can use for shading to add depth. These improved visuals are, I believe, also responsible for another major design trend in this generation, which is the trend of using bold, contrasting colors in a Pokemon's design. Common contrasting colors found in this generation include red and green, found in the designs of Pokemon like Grovyle, Dustox, Breloom, Gardevoir, Flygon, and Kecleon. Red and blue on Pokemon such as Tailo, Nosepass, Volbeat, Crawdaunt, Milotic, Kyogre, Chimecho, and Salamence. And blue and orange with Pokemon like Swampert, Pelipper, Masquerain, Haryana, Huntail, and Deoxys. And these are by no means exhaustive lists. Other contrasting color schemes, such as yellow and purple, can also be found. The sprites are also slightly higher resolution. The sprites in the first 2 generations were 56 by 56 pixels, while sprites in these games are 64 by 64. This results in about 1.3 times as many pixels in a single sprite. This isn't a massive increase, but does allow for the additional of some extra details such as the red spots on Relicanth's back, the braille-like patterns found on the Reggi's faces, and Nuzleaf's nipples. This improved technology also supports a number of new mechanics, and these new mechanics, in turn, influence the designs of many Pokemon. While Generation 3 introduced many new mechanics, such as contests, secret bases, and Pokemon natures, the one that influenced designs the most is the additions of unique abilities for each Pokemon. These abilities do a wide range of things, such as boosting a Pokemon's stats in particular weather, or making them immune to certain status effects. While most of the common abilities are relatively minor, some Pokemon have unique abilities that completely shape the way the Pokemon is used. When it comes to Pokemon design, it's often a chicken and egg sort of situation. Was the ability created for the Pokemon, or was the Pokemon designed to fit the ability? While we can't know for sure, there are a number of Pokemon where I believe the ability strongly influenced the design. The clearest example is Castform, whose ability allows it to change forms based on the current weather. This also makes it the first Pokemon that can change forms in the middle of a battle. Another example is Kecleon, which has the ability to change types based on the types of damage it receives. Shedinja has the unique ability Wonder Guard, which makes it immune to attacks that aren't super effective. While the relationship between the ability and the Pokemon's design is less clear than for a Pokemon like Kecleon, the ability and design are both so unique that I believe they must be connected somehow. Finally, Slaking is a massive sloth, and its ability only allows it to attack every other turn. This ability not only likely had an effect on the visual design of the Pokemon, but also its base stats, which are much higher than would normally be allowed on a non-legendary Pokemon because the ability is such a downside. Finally, like last time, I'd like to take a moment to directly compare Pokemon from Generation 3 with Pokemon from previous generations that share similar roles. What's up, designers, and welcome back to Rempton Games. In today's installment of Evolution of Pokemon Designs, we're going to be taking a look at the 4th generation of Pokemon, which includes the games Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum. As always, in this video, I'm going to take a look at the Pokemon of this generation to find any themes and trends. I'm going to see how new mechanics and technology have influenced the designs, and compare them to previous generations. Without further ado, let's get started. First, let's take a look at how Generation 4 fits in with previous games in the series. These games find themselves in an interesting middle space because they're neither direct sequels like Generation 2, nor are they a soft reboot like Generation 3. Instead, these games fill a middle ground that's relatively unique among Pokemon games. They tell a unique original story in a new region with new characters, and yet the Pokemon selection is very heavily tied to previous generations. This generation introduces 107 new Pokemon, and 29 of them are either evolutions or pre-evolutions of older Pokemon. This represents over a quarter of all the new Pokemon introduced, and this is the highest proportion of Pokemon that are related to older Pokemon of any generation if you don't count things like Mega Evolution. In addition, unlike Generation 2, which also introduced a large number of new evolutions, but they were only related to Generation 1 Pokemon, Generation 4 introduces new Pokemon that are related to all 3 previous generations pretty evenly, which, in my personal opinion, helps make the wider world of Pokemon feel a little bit more connected. Speaking of which, this generation is quite possibly the most connected of any generation so far. While Gen 3 took a little bit of heat for not being able to connect to the games previous to it, Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum are the first games that are compatible with the generation before and after them. If you include the remakes of Fire Red, Leaf Green, Heart Gold, and Soul Silver, you can actually trade Pokemon back and forth between 5 different regions in these games. However, this isn't the only way that this generation attempted to make the Pokemon world more connected. A major theme of this generation is legends and myths, and they introduce a huge amount of lore and backstory for the Pokemon world. While previous generations have had legends such as the battle between Groudon and Kyogre or the Burned Tower, Generation 4 really takes this to the next level. For one thing, this generation introduces more legendary and mythical Pokemon than any other generation before it, with 14 total. Depending on whether you consider Meltan and Melmetal to be part of Gen 7 or Gen 8, they could still be tied for the number 1 spot. However, not only do they introduce a glut of legendary and mythical Pokemon, but they also introduce the Pokemon that are, lore-wise at least, still the most powerful that the Pokemon world has ever seen. These include the god Pokemon Arceus, who supposedly created the universe with his 1,000 arms, as well as his children Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina. As the legend goes, there was once a void of nothingness in which a single egg appeared. This egg hatched into Arceus. Arceus then created Dialga and Palkia and gave them control over time and space. He also created Giratina, the Pokemon of antimatter, and banished him to the Distortion world for his violent behavior, which basically makes Giratina the Pokemon world equivalent of Satan. He also created the Lake Trio of Azelf, Uxie, and Mesprit, which control willpower, emotion, and knowledge, which can be found in all humans and Pokemon. There is also Regigigas, who not only apparently created all of the other Regis out of stone, ice, and metal, but apparently moved the continents into place. This epic theme goes beyond the legendary Pokemon themselves, however. The Sinnoh region is shrouded in history and myth, and is not only considered to be the oldest region, but is also said to be the first place that Arceus created when he created the universe. There are a number of places in the Sinnoh region that are incredibly ancient or connected to various myths, such as Flow Aroma Town, Eterna City, Snow Point Temple, and the Spear Pillar. Even the starter Pokemon of this region play into this theme, as they're all based on real-world myths and legends. Empoleon is clearly inspired by Poseidon, especially with a trident-like design on his head and body. Torterra seems to be based on various myths about the world tortoise or turtle, particularly those found in Hindu mythology. Finally, Infernape is a clear reference to Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, a major character in the Chinese epic Journey to the West. This marks the first time that all 3 starter Pokemon will have a unifying theme, a trend that will continue in future generations. In addition, a number of non-legendary Pokemon are also given legendary backstories, such as Spiritomb, which is said to contain 108 evil spirits. Now that we have covered some of the themes and backstory, it's time to actually begin looking at the designs of these Pokemon. From looking at Generation 4 Pokemon, it's immediately obvious that the designs have become more detailed than previous generations. This may be due to the increased resolution of the DS screen over the Game Boy Advance. While the actual screens themselves are only slightly higher resolution, the Pokemon sprites are much larger, 80 by 80 pixels rather than 64 by 64. This results in nearly 60% more pixels per sprite than on the Game Boy Advance, which could be a major reason why Generation 4 Pokemon have a higher level of detail on average. This increased detail can be seen in a number of places. In previous generations, it was rare to see a Pokemon with 4 or more colors. However, in Generation 4, this is the norm. This generation contains a number of quite colorful Pokemon such as Luxray, Garchomp, Toxicroak, and Cresselia, and even Pokemon that may not be considered colorful such as Staraptor or Floatzel fit this description. Second, similar to previous generations, there are a number of recurring details on Generation 4 Pokemon, and many of these contribute to the more complicated designs of Pokemon in this generation. While adding additional detail in the form of stripes, rings, or loops is a common design choice in every generation, Generation 4 really takes this to the next level. Of all the details that are common in this generation, however, the most noticeable is certainly the spikes. Once again, Pokemon has a history of adding spikes or horns to traditionally non-spiky animals. Simply look at Seaking, Seal, or Cloyster to see how adding a single spike or horn was a common way of making an animal look just a bit more monstrous. This generation, however, went absolutely hog wild with the spikes, adding them not just to the forehead, but to the wrists, shoulders, wherever. The designs of Pokemon such as Lucario, Drapion, Bastiodon, Garchomp, and Rampardos are absolutely spectacular. While I generally try to avoid giving my own opinions in these videos, I think a good number of the Pokemon in this generation would look much better if they simply toned down one or two of the details. Let's take a look at a few examples to see what I mean. First, let's take a look at Perugly. As you can see, there's a lot going on with this design. From the boomerang-shaped head to the purple fingers at the tips of its ears, the squiggly whiskers, the curly tail, tiny feet. There are a ton of distracting design decisions going on here, and make the Pokemon overall look very cluttered. Suppose we simplified just one of these details, say the ears, and made them more traditionally cat-like. It could still retain its grumpy, spoiled attitude while having a bit cleaner overall design. Let's quickly look at a second example, this time an evolution to a previous generation, Ambipom. Ambipom is the evolution of Aipom, a mischievous little monkey Pokemon from Generation 2. Aipom is a relatively simple design. It's simply a purple monkey with a hand on its tail, and a troublemaking personality. Now look at Ambipom. First, you can immediately notice that we're adding a third color, a reddish shade in the ears and on the tips of the fingers. This not only makes the color palette more complicated, but has the added side effect of making the fingers look painfully swollen. The head shares a number of similarities with Aipom's head, but adds a nose, a bowl cut, and 2 extra long strands on the top of the head. Personally, I find this nose marking to be probably the ugliest nose of any Pokemon. I think that this design could be significantly more pleasant by simply removing the nose and swapping out the gross new hands with hands that match Aipom's originals. Sure, the new design maybe doesn't change all that much. It simply looks like a bigger Aipom with 2 hands instead of 1, but I think it's enough change to make it recognizable as a different Pokemon, while still looking clearly connected to its pre-evolution and not adding unnecessary details that detract from the design. There are 2 additional major design decisions that I noticed about Generation 4 Pokemon. First, it moves away from the more jagged fur designs in previous generations to more rounded fur shapes. If you look at Pokemon like Glameow, Bidoof, Shaman, Buizel, Baniri, and even Luxray, you can see that the fur tends to have a much more rounded look. Don't get me wrong, purely sharp, jagged fur still exists in this generation, but I believe that this is the beginning of a softening of Pokemon designs that would continue for the next few generations. The second additional design decision is, paradoxically, the simplification or reduction of certain details. Compare, for example, the roses on Roserade's hands versus those on Roselia's. It is clear to see that Roselia's roses are much more realistic, while Roserades are much more simplified. Similarly, look at the vines on Tangrowth versus Tangela, and it's clear to see that there is a certain amount of lost detail. Finally, if you look at the tongues of Licky Licky versus Lickitung, there's a clear difference, with Lickitung's tongue looking much more organic. Finally, let's take a look at the legendary Pokemon of this generation, and there are a lot of them. First off, looking at this group as a whole, it's clear to see that the increased level of detail is equally present among these legendary Pokemon. Although legendary Pokemon have always had more complicated designs in general, so I think it's more fitting. However, another thing to notice is that a large number of these legendary Pokemon don't resemble any real-world animals or objects. Instead, they have much more abstract designs that evoke an idea. Heatran, for example, has aspects of many different animals, but the overall design simply evokes the concept of lava monster. Similarly, Arceus's design looks fittingly divine, while Darkrai's definitely looks like something that would give you nightmares. I think a big reason for this is that most of these Pokemon are designed to be very ancient, like from the beginning of the universe, and therefore it makes sense that they wouldn't resemble modern-day animals. Narrowing in on the group of Palkia, Dialga, and Giratina, I like how all of their designs feel very connected to that of Arceus, particularly their faces. Not only does this do a good job of communicating that they're a trio, but it also illustrates that they were the first Pokemon that Arceus created. The children resemble the parent, if you will. These designs are all very abstract, and while they're all quite complicated, I think they do a good job of making a Pokemon that looks legendary and powerful. The last group of Pokemon I want to look at this week is the Lake Trio of Uxie, Azelf, and Mesprit. I want to narrow in on these Pokemon specifically, because they're the first real instance of copy-paste design found in the Pokédex. All of these legendary Pokemon look very similar to one another, and are also very similar to Mew. While none of these designs necessarily look bad in their own right, Pokemon has already shown that it's possible to make a trio of legendaries that all look connected without sharing the exact same design with different hats. Unfortunately, this design philosophy will get worse before it gets better. Finally, as we have in the past, let's do a side-by-side comparison of Pokemon from this generation versus Pokemon from previous generations. While watching this apples-to-apples comparison, see if you can find any additional design trends or similarities that I may have missed. Designers, and welcome back to Rempton Games. Today, I'm very excited to present part 5 of the Evolution of Pokemon design series, this time focusing on Pokemon Black and White. This generation has the most new Pokemon, is one of the biggest conceptual shifts in the series, and is also one of the most controversial generations so far, so I've got a lot to talk about. As I mentioned before, Generation 5 is a very interesting generation because it represents a bit of a shift in focus for the series. In an Iwata Asks interview, Junichi Masuda explains that the development team was very nervous about designing Black and White because this would be the first time that a new generation was developed on the same hardware as the previous generation. Up until this point, every new generation has been on a new piece of hardware. Red and Green on the original Game Boy, Gold and Silver on the Game Boy Color, Ruby and Sapphire on the Game Boy Advance, and Diamond and Pearl on the Nintendo DS. This change in hardware created an inherent distinction between each generation. However, this time there was no change in hardware, and the team was worried that unless they deliberately shook things up, the games would end up feeling too similar to the previous generation. This attitude towards designing these games resulted in a number of changes beginning in this generation. This can be seen perhaps most obviously with the choice of region. All 4 previous regions, Kanto, Johto, Hoenn, and Sinnoh, were all based on different parts of Japan. On the other hand, this new generation's region, Unova, is based on New York City in the United States. Choosing to base a region on the United States had a number of ripple effects on the design. First, it resulted in the creation of a number of Pokemon with American influences, such as Braviary, the bald eagle Pokemon, LGM being based on the Roswell aliens, Bouffalant the bison, Sigilyph being based on Native American artwork and the Nazca lines, and Maractus being based on cactuses found in the American Southwest. Although this region draws inspiration from many different parts of America, it's still primarily based on New York, and for this reason it's one of the most urbanized regions and has the biggest city seen so far, Castelia City. Because of this, many Pokemon designs in this generation have an urban influence, such as Watchog being based on a crossing guard, the Pidove line being based on pigeons, the Conkeldurr line being influenced by construction workers, as well as Pokemon like Garbodor, Vanillix, and Scrafty all making sense in an urban environment. Choosing to make a region set outside of Japan also had a number of other effects on the design. One of these was an emphasis on diversity. Japan's population is very not diverse. According to a 2018 census, Japan's population is 97.8% ethnically Japanese. The United States is much more ethnically diverse, with large populations of people from European, African, Asian, Native American, and South American descent. Because of this, these games have a much more diverse set of human characters than previous generations, with characters such as Iris, Marshall, Lenora, Alder, and Marlin clearly not belonging to the light-skinned race of generic anime people. The focus on diversity doesn't seem to have had too much of an effect on the designs of Pokemon in this generation, with one huge exception. Each of the starter Pokemon of this generation actually represent a different cultural background, with Serperior being based on European nobles, Emboar being designed like an ancient Chinese warlord, and Samurott, of course, representing a medieval Japanese samurai. The last and most impactful consequence of choosing to set a region outside of Japan was the distance to the previous regions. In the previous generations, it was totally normal to walk around and find Pokemon that are native to other regions. However, as a way to show just how far the Unova region is from the previous 4, Game Freak made the decision that you wouldn't find any Pokemon from previous generations in the wild until after you beat the game. This decision had a huge influence on the direction of the game and brought it very close to reboot status. The decision not to include any Pokemon from previous generations very strongly influenced what Pokemon they had to design this time around. For the very first time, for example, this generation doesn't include any Pokemon that are evolutions or pre-evolutions of previous Pokemon. This means that certain designs that may have initially been related to previous generations, such as Luvdisc evolving into Alomomola or Tauros turning into Bouffalant, ended up being turned into their own single-stage Pokemon. This decision also caused the team to design Pokemon that fill roles that are eerily similar to Pokemon from the past. While certain types of Pokemon, such as starters and cover legendaries, are repeated pretty much every generation, Gen 5 gets much more specific than that. For example, in previous generations, you could occasionally find a Pokeball on the ground, pick it up, and it turns out to actually be a Voltorb. This is very similar to the classic idea of a Mimic chest that's found in a large number of RPGs. Because the team decided not to include any older Pokemon this time around, they created a new Mimic Pokemon, Fungus, to serve this same role. Similarly, in the anime, Chansey and Blissey are often shown assisting Nurse Joys at Pokemon centers. This generation needed a new Pokemon to fill that role, so Audino was born. Woobat and Swoobat were designed to fill the role of bats that you can find in caves instead of Zubat, while Roggenrola replaces Geodude in those same caves. You have a fighting-type duo with contrasting fighting styles, a 3-stage fighting line that evolves by trading, a psychic dream-based tapir, and I could keep going. All of these designs are clear callbacks to Pokemon from Generation 1, and are meant to fill a role that was left vacant by the lack of older Pokemon. The decision not to include any older Pokemon also put restrictions on the elemental types that could be included. This generation had to stand on its own, which meant that it had to have enough Pokemon of each different type. This led to several Pokemon changing types to create a better variety. Stunfisk, for example, was originally a water-electric type but got changed to electric ground. Similarly, the Frillish line was originally pure water, but the ghost type got added during balancing. While being based in the US certainly had a huge influence on the design of these games, that wasn't the only thing they had going for them. Pokemon Black and White also had the thematic motif of opposites working together, and truth versus ideals. This can be seen most clearly when looking at the cover legendaries of these games. Pokemon White gets the black legendary Zekrom, while Pokemon Black gets the white legendary Reshiram. This also connects with the origin of these Pokemon in the lore of the games. According to legend, there were two brothers who used an ancient dragon Pokemon to create the Unova region. However, these brothers soon came into conflict, because one strived for truth while the other fought for his ideals. In response to this conflict, the ancient dragon split into two, Reshiram and Zekrom. Reshiram, representing truth and yang, sided with the older brother, while Zekrom, representing ideals and yin, sided with the younger brother. The leftover empty shell of the original dragon became the ice dragon Kyurem, which represents the concept of Wuji, the absence of yin and yang. The concept of opposites also shows up in other places in the game. Certain locations, such as Opelucid City, will have a more advanced technological appearance in Black version, and a more ancient rustic appearance in Pokemon White. There are also exclusive locations in each version. Black City, of course, is exclusive to Black, and White Forest is exclusive to White. Unfortunately, this theme doesn't really seem to show up in the designs of the Pokemon, aside from the aforementioned legendaries. Even the version-exclusive counterparts, Mandibuzz vs Braviary or Reuniclus vs Gothitelle, don't really seem to play up the theme of opposites any more than version exclusives from previous generations. Aside from these themes, there were a number of technological and mechanical advances that had an effect on the designs of these Pokemon. The first of these is the addition of in-game seasons that change every month. This mechanic hasn't come back in any generation since, but it is responsible for the design of one Pokemon family, Deerling and Sawsbuck. These Pokemon are both grass normal types, and have 4 different forms based on the current season. Characters in the game often influence the design of certain Pokemon, such as Volcarona specifically being designed to be the champion's ace, but Black and White has a very interesting example of this. The first gym you'll encounter in Black and White is very unusual because it actually has 3 different gym leaders, Cress, Salon, and Chili, that specialize in the elements of water, grass, and fire respectively. Which one you face will depend on which starter Pokemon you picked. You'll always face the gym leader whose element is super effective against yours. The 3 monkey Pokemon Panpour, Pansage, and Pansear were specifically designed to be used with these 3 gym leaders in order to support this gimmick. The way Pokemon were displayed in this generation also changed significantly from Gen 4. Although these games were on the same hardware as Diamond and Pearl, they not only found a way to increase the size of each sprite, from 80 by 80 pixels to 96 by 96, but each Pokemon is also continuously animated. I think we've started to hit the point where the increase in the size of the sprite will have diminishing returns on what types of Pokemon can be designed, but the continuous animation did somewhat expand the types of Pokemon that could be created. Klingklang's design, of gears constantly turning together, really needs to be seen in motion to work. Similarly, Scrafty's animation really helps drive home the idea that it's wearing saggy pants made of its own shed skin, and Reuniclus's animation makes it seem more transparent, something that would not come across as clearly in a static sprite. Other designs, such as Kofagrigus and Cubchoo, maybe didn't strictly need animation to work, but it really helps sell the design and personality of these Pokemon. Now it's time to look at some design trends in this generation that don't necessarily fit into any of the above categories. I will say that Gen 5 is particularly difficult to characterize in terms of an overall style, for a number of reasons. First, it introduces more Pokemon than any other generation, so for any trend that you try to point out, you'll have a large number of counterexamples that don't fit with that trend. In addition, Gen 5 had more artists working on it than any other previous generation, which means more people are putting their own unique spins on Pokemon designs. That being said, I do think there is one major trend that characterizes this generation as a whole, and that's the willingness to make Pokemon designs that are weird, goofy, and bizarre. For the first time since Gen 1, we get Pokemon with multiple heads like Vanillix and Hydreigon, or multiple bodies like Klingklang. We also get goofy designs like Stunfisk, which was specifically designed to be the flattest Pokemon, Trubbish, which is a derpy bag of trash, and Sigilyph, which is still quite possibly the strangest Pokemon design ever made. It may also be helpful to note some of the trends that Gen 5 didn't carry over from Generation 4. First is the lack of random or unnecessary spikes in the designs. It's not that none of these Pokemon have spikes, it's just that they seem more integrated into the designs of Pokemon like Pawniard, Ferrothorn, and Gigalith, rather than simply pasted on like Rampardos or Lucario. Similarly, while the designs of Pokemon in this generation aren't necessarily less busy than in Gen 4, I think that the extra details tie in more closely with the concept of the Pokemon. They feel less extraneous. Because of this, I feel like there are very few Pokemon in this generation that feel over-designed. The big, glaring exceptions to this are the cover legendaries of the sequels, Kyurem White and Kyurem Black. Just looking at these Pokemon visually, it's clear that they have a lot going on, but I think they're also trying to do too much from a conceptual level. These designs each represent Kyurem fused with either Reshiram or Zekrom, so clearly the design wants to represent the different parts of the fusion. However, it also wants to convey a sense of incompleteness, since the fused dragon is still missing a piece, and the designs also try to convey that this fusion is unnatural due to the artificial nature of the fusion. That's a lot to try to convey in a creature design, and ends up leaving the end result feeling extremely cluttered, although one could argue that this is intentional. Finally, I just want to briefly touch on some of the controversy around the designs of this generation. There have been claims for a while among certain members of the Pokemon fandom that Game Freak is running out of ideas for Pokemon, and I think that this idea started, or at least really picked up traction, around the release of Pokemon Black and White. Some designs in this generation, such as the Vanillite family, Trubbish, Stunfisk, Klingklang, and the Three Monkeys, were very unpopular when these games were first released, and were put forth as evidence for the idea that Game Freak was running out of ideas. While I don't personally think Game Freak will run out of ideas anytime soon, I do think some of this criticism is valid. With the three monkey Pokemon, their evolutions, as well as the legendary genies Tornadus, Thundurus, and Landorus, this shows that the designers of this generation were willing to release Pokemon that were basically palette-swapped versions of each other. On the one hand, this is something that pretty much every other RPG with monsters does. For example, a game like Dragon Quest might turn their slime a different color to show that it is a little bit stronger now. However, I think we've come to expect more from Pokemon, and expect each design to be more unique. On the other hand, I don't have a problem with many of the other Pokemon that were listed. Garbodor, for example, is a being made of trash. He's a replacement for Muck, a first-gen Pokemon made of toxic sludge. I see no reason why, in the Pokemon world we have been presented, a Pokemon made of trash or that simply resembles trash wouldn't make sense. True, it looks a bit derpy, but derpy Pokemon have been around forever as well. Similarly, nobody really seems to like Kling Kling since it's just a bunch of gears. True, but I think gears are underappreciated. You can make some really cool things out of gears, such as mechanical computers, and Kling Kling actually makes use of a wide variety of different types of fun gears, like Sun and Planet and Bevel gears. So yes, the design may just look like a bunch of gears, but as before, I see no reason why that can't be a Pokemon. That being said, this generation does contain what I consider to be the worst, laziest Pokemon design in the entire series. Place your bets on who I could be referring to. Drumroll please. It's Basculin. Sorry if you're a Basculin fan, but I think it is an awful design, and here's why. First, it reminds me way too much of Carvanha, but I would say that Carvanha is more interesting because not only is it a water and dark type instead of just pure water, but it also evolves into a shark. Basculin, on the other hand, is a single-stage Pokemon with below-average stats. Basculin was also only designed because there was a shortage of fish Pokemon in this generation. However, not only was it added basically as an afterthought, but it was also given 2 different forms that barely differ at all, purely as a way to increase the number of different fish that could be caught. That being said, with a generation as big as this one, you're sure to have some misses, and I actually think that overall, this is one of the most creative generations so far. But what do you think? Are there any other major trends that I missed that I should have talked about? Do you strongly disagree with me about Basculin or any of the other Pokemon that I mentioned? Let me know in the comments down below. What's up, designers, and welcome back to Rempton Games. We're back again with another installment of the Evolution of Pokemon Design series, this time focusing on Generation 6. As always, we'll be looking at the designs of Pokemon in this generation to see their common trends and motifs, and also see how they have changed since previous generations. We'll also be looking at new mechanics, technological improvements, and themes of these games to see how they influence the designs of these Pokemon. Let's begin by talking about the new region the players get to explore in these games, the Kalos region. Continuing the trend started last generation of exploring regions based outside of Japan, the Kalos region is based on France. However, unlike the previous generation, it's still possible to find Pokemon from other regions in Kalos, despite the fact that it's based on a country on an entirely different continent. Being based on France does of course present the opportunity for a number of new French-themed Pokemon designs, or simply designs that have a European flair. These include Aegislash, Furfrou, Aromatisse, Slurpuff, and Delphox. Not to get too sidetracked, but for this reason there are a number of Gen 5 Pokemon that I always thought would have made more sense in Generation 6, particularly Carablast, Escavalier, Shelmet, Excelgor, and the Musketeers Terrakion, Cobalion, Virizion, and Keldeo. The former group is themed after European knights and snails, which would be much more thematic for a French-inspired region than a New York-inspired one. And the latter group is literally based on the Three Musketeers, a French novel. Not only would it have made sense thematically, but it also would have helped Gen 6 significantly. Generation 5 introduced the most new Pokemon of any generation with 156. Gen 6, on the other hand, introduces the fewest, with only 72, less than half the number of the previous generation. Gen 6 also only introduces a single family of Bug-type Pokemon, so it could use a few more, and it only has a single trio of legendary Pokemon, while Gen 5 has 3. It just would have evened things out a bit, you know? In addition to being based on France, the Kalos region also has a theme of beauty. The evil team of this region is Team Flare, whose goal is to create a beautiful world by destroying everything that they find to be ugly. Many other characters also play into this theme. Valerie, a gym leader, is also a fashion designer, while Grant is a style icon who set a new trend with his hairstyle, and the champion Diantha is a famous movie star. Aside from various characters being concerned with beauty or having very stylish jobs, This theme also plays into the game mechanically in a few different ways. First, X and Y are the first games in the series where you can customize your player's appearance, giving them new clothes, hairstyles, etc. However, that isn't the only thing you can customize. You can also cut and style the fur of the Pokemon Furfrou into 7 different fancy styles. Given that Kalos is based on a country in Europe, the home of fairy tales, it is perhaps fitting that Generation 6 introduces the Fairy type to the game. The Fairy type is the first new type to be added to the game since Dark and Steel types were introduced in Generation 2 in 1999, and was primarily added to help balance the type chart. Fairy types are immune to Dragon type attacks, which helps add an additional check to the very powerful Dragon type, which was previously only weak to itself and Ice type. In addition, Fairy is weak to Steel and Poison types, which helps increase the usefulness of these types offensively. As this was the first new type in a long time, the Fairy type had a lot of catching up to do. So, in addition to changing the types of over 20 older Pokemon into Fairies, X and Y also introduced 13 new Fairy type Pokemon, making up over 18% of all the new Pokemon introduced. These include Florges, Dedenne, Carbink, Klefki, Xerneas, and Sylveon. Design-wise, the Fairy type's most obvious visual trait is its association with the color pink. Many of the new Fairy type Pokemon are pink, and many older pink Pokemon had their types changed to become fairies. Aside from this, the Fairy type also has associations with the moon, magical creatures including actual folklore fairies, and magic in general. Sylveon specifically also connects with a brand new feature of this generation, the Pokemon-Ami. The Pokemon-Ami allows players to play with, feed, and pet their Pokemon, and the more you interact with your Pokemon, the more it raises a brand new stat, Affection. As your Pokemon's affection gets higher, it gets certain bonuses in battle, such as healing from status effects so that its trainer won't get worried, or surviving certain attacks that would normally cause it to faint with 1 HP. This connects with Sylveon because in addition to requiring Eevee to know at least one Fairy type move, Eevee must also reach a high level of affection in order to evolve into a Sylveon. The Fairy type isn't the only thing that connects the Kalos region to fairy tales. Continuing on with the trends of the previous few generations, the starter Pokemon of Generation 6 all have a single unifying theme. In this case, they're all based around RPG character archetypes. Chestnut is a knight or warrior, Greninja is a thief or rogue, and Delphox is a wizard or magic user. I mentioned earlier that Pokemon X and Y introduced the Pokemon-Ami and the Affection stat. However, these are far from the only mechanical additions to this generation. These games also introduce one of the biggest changes to the combat formula in the entire history of the series, with the addition of Mega Evolution. Mega Evolution is a special ability that certain fully evolved Pokemon can activate when holding a special stone, called a Mega Stone. This ability allows those Pokemon to change into new, more powerful Mega forms. Mega Evolution is, in my opinion, one of the coolest additions to the Pokemon series. While some of the Pokemon that received Mega Evolutions were already quite powerful, such as Metagross and Salamence, many Mega Evolutions were given to Pokemon that were less used, such as Mawile, Kangaskhan, and Altaria, and turned these rarely used Pokemon into competitive powerhouses. Mega Evolution was a cool idea because it was more than just a stat boost. It basically allowed for a complete redesign of the Pokemon, both in gameplay and appearance. Mega forms could rearrange a Pokemon's stats, change their types, and even give them new abilities that completely change the way you use these Pokemon. New Mega forms also allowed for new designs for these Pokemon, something that had never really been possible in the series up until this point. As the name implies, many of these new designs are pretty over the top, taking elements of the Pokemon's original design and really cranking them up to 11. You have a big flower on your back? Even bigger flower. 2 spoons? Now 5 spoons. 1 ponytail mouth? 2 ponytail mouths. Have some spikes, and some Fabio hair. Zippers, more spikes, whatever the heck this thing is. Bing, bang, boom! Mega Evolution design is big, loud, and with very few exceptions, its only goal seems to be to crank the cool factor up to 11. While this does result in some pretty cool designs, some of my favorites include Mega Banette, Diancie, Gengar, especially Shiny, and Altaria, I think many of the Mega designs end up being very cluttered and even tacky. In many ways, Mega Evolution takes many of the design philosophies from Generation 4 and takes them to their logical extreme, producing designs that are so covered in details it can be hard to even tell what's going on, and so exaggerated that they just look ridiculous. Some of the worst offenders of this are Garchomp, Manectric, Medicham, Aerodactyl, Abomasnow, and especially Sharpedo. One of the other interesting things about Mega Pokemon, and possibly even Fairy-type Pokemon, is that they represent a split in the Pokemon timeline. There's a Pokemon world with Mega Evolution, and a Pokemon world without. This generation is one of the first to really expand the concept of the Pokemon multiverse, which is a topic that I'm definitely interested in exploring more in a future video. In contrast to the complicated, bold designs of many of the Mega Pokemon, most of Gen 6's other designs are actually pretty subdued, using simple shapes, textures, and relatively few colors. They also tend to be quite round. While Pokemon has always had rounded designs, it's usually mixed in with several jagged, rough, and sharp outlines as well. Over the past few generations, however, starting in Gen 4, many of these sharper lines are being replaced with softer, rounder shapes. In Gen 6, there are almost no sharp lines in the designs of these Pokemon, and smooth, rounded edges are extremely common. Great examples of this include Fletchling, Gogoat, Swirlix, Goodra, Amora, and Gourgeist, who all have very simple, rounded designs. This roundness also carries into the eyes. I haven't talked about Pokemon eyes in a few generations because, starting around Generation 3, the variety of different eye styles becomes so diverse that there's almost no clear trends to really latch onto. However, one trend in this generation is a clear preference for simpler, more rounded eye styles that would almost make more sense in an American-style cartoon rather than a traditional anime. Some good examples of this are Quilladin, Bunnelby, Litleo, Helioptile, and Goodra. While there are a handful of sharper, more aggressive-looking designs such as Trevenant, Barbaracle, and Tyrantrum, they are a clear minority in this generation. This generation is the first in the series to make the switch from the DS to the 3DS, and one of the biggest technological shifts in this generation is the move away from 2D sprites to 3D models for every Pokemon. While I can't really say what effect this had on the designs of newer Pokemon, it had a clear effect on the appearance of some older Pokemon. To generalize a bit, many of the colors on the 3D models are much less saturated when compared to those on the 2D sprites. Some good examples of this are Starmie, Charizard, and especially Parasect. Given this, it's possible that the colors of the newer Pokemon are somewhat less vibrant than they would have been in previous generations. One additional, although relatively minor change that was made possible by the 3DS hardware was Inkay's evolution. Inkay evolves at level 30 or above if you hold your DS upside down. This relies on the 3DS's gyroscope and would have been impossible on previous hardware. Finally, let's talk about the legendary Pokemon of this generation. As mentioned before, there's a bit of a shortage of legendary Pokemon this time around. We only get the cover legendary trio of Xerneas, Yveltal, and Zygarde, the fewest legendary Pokemon introduced into any generation. In addition, the actual legends surrounding these Pokemon are a bit lacking. Xerneas represents life and is shaped like an X, while Yveltal represents death and is shaped like a Y. Zygarde is shaped like a Z and is meant to keep order between the two. Pretty basic stuff and very similar to something like Kyogre, Groudon, and Rayquaza. We also only get a handful of mythical Pokemon with Hoopa, Diancie, and Volcanion. Volcanion is unique for being a water and fire type, but is otherwise quite forgettable. Diancie is interesting because it's a mutated form of Carbink, a non-legendary Pokemon. This somewhat connects to the idea that the legendary beasts Raikou, Entei, and Suicune are actually mutated versions of Jolteon, Flareon, and Vaporeon. and it makes you wonder if there are any other legendary Pokemon out there that were originally something else. This is something I would love to see explored with future legendary Pokemon as well. Finally, Hoopa is notable for its ability to create portals and wormholes, which only adds further fuel to the fire of my Pokemon multiverse theory. What's up, designers, and welcome back to Rempton Games. In today's episode of the Evolution of Pokemon Design series, we've made it all the way to the Generation 7 games, Pokemon Sun and Pokemon Moon. These games do more than most in the series to mix up the traditional formula, and while I have mixed feelings about the games themselves, I do think this is possibly the most interesting generation of all in terms of the Pokemon designs themselves. As always, we'll be looking at themes and general motifs, as well as technological and mechanical innovations to see how the Pokemon of this generation are different from previous Pokemon in the series. Without further ado, let's get started. Pokemon Sun and Moon are the second games in the series to take place in an American-inspired region, specifically the region of Alola, which is based on the islands of Hawaii. Much like in Generation 5 with the Unova region, the choice of region in this generation had a huge effect on the design of the games and the Pokemon. Most obviously, there are several new Pokemon that are clearly based on Hawaiian culture, including Comfey, which is based on Alay, POW-style Oricorio, modeled after hula dancing, Bruxish, based on Hawaii's official state fish, the reef triggerfish, and the island guardian Pokemon of Tapu Koko, Tapu Lele, Tapu Bulu, and Tapu Fini, which are based on the four major gods in the Hawaiian religion. In addition to these strongly Hawaiian-themed Pokemon, there are many Pokemon in this generation that are also based on other islands or tropical regions around the world, including Toucanon, based on the toucans of Central and South America, Passimian, modeled after the lemurs of the island of Madagascar, Komala, drawing inspiration from the koalas of Australia, and even the Tsarina family, which are based on the mangosteen, a fruit native to the islands of Thailand and called the Queen of Fruits. In addition to taking inspiration from tropical and island-themed animals and plants, the decision to place this game in a isolated island-themed region plays into the themes of the game more broadly. The first major theme of this game is evolution, and not in the way that Pokemon usually deals with it. The islands of Alola are completely separate from the rest of the Pokemon world, and this has caused everything on them to evolve completely differently from everywhere else. This can be seen with the people and tradition of the island. The culture of Alola is very different from other regions in the series. Instead of taking on gym challenges, for example, the trainers of Alola take on island trials, where they must solve unique puzzles and fight gigantic, uniquely powered totem Pokemon. Functionally, this isn't that much different from taking on traditional Pokemon gyms, but it does show the focus that these games have on the unique traditions and culture of the Alola region. However, the themes of adaptation and evolution can be seen most clearly with the Pokemon themselves. For the first time, Sun and Moon introduced brand new Alolan forms for older Generation 1 Pokemon, giving these Pokemon brand new forms and types. This is not only a cool way to add new forms for older Pokemon in a generation that sadly doesn't include Mega Evolution, but it also mimics the way that evolution works in real life. Because they're surrounded by water, islands are completely isolated ecosystems and often develop completely new species that aren't found anywhere else. These Alolan forms presumably started out exactly the same as Pokemon from other regions, and were able to evolve in completely different forms in a new ecosystem. Several of these regional forms also play into the tropical and Hawaiian themes of the region, including Alolan Marowak, who looks like a fire dancer, Alolan Raichu, which surfs on its tail, and Alolan Executor, who grows much taller and becomes a grass dragon type in what is considered to be its true form. These games even introduce a human character, Samson Oak, who is basically the Alolan form of his cousin, Professor Oak, from the original Red and Green games. Aside from the Alolan forms, the other Pokemon that represents this theme of evolution is Oricorio. Oricorio is a flying-type Pokemon whose form and secondary type change depending on which island it's found on. It has the Fire-type Bile style, Electric Pom-Pom style, the Psychic Pow style, and the Ghost Sensu style. The Oricorio forms are a pretty clear reference to Darwin's finches, a group of birds found on the Galapagos Islands that developed different beaks on different islands and helped Darwin form his theory of evolution. While isolated ecosystems can sometimes lead to some really interesting and unique creatures, they also have a downside. They tend to be incredibly fragile. This leads to the second major theme of these games: invasive species. The introduction of outside species into a new ecosystem can be catastrophic and is a major problem not only on islands but all around the world. Many Pokémon found in the Alola region weren't originally native to these islands, but were instead brought there by trainers from other regions. These include Alolan forms like Rattata and Meowth, but it also includes Pokemon like Mareanie and Yungoos, which make their first appearances in these games. In fact, Yungoos were intentionally brought to the Alolan Islands to stop the spread of the invasive Rattata, but it didn't work because the Rattata evolved to be nocturnal, whereas the Yungoos were active during the day. This mimics what actually happened on the Hawaiian Islands when mongooses were brought to catch rats, but ended up having a catastrophic effect on the bird populations of the islands. This theme of invasive species also inspired one of my favorite additions to this generation: the Ultra Beasts. The Ultra Beasts are a group of Pokémon from another dimension that are invading the Alola region through the use of Ultra Wormholes. The Ultra Beasts are very unique monsters in the series because they're not from the normal Pokémon world and definitely look the part. While many fans were upset when the Ultra Beasts were originally revealed because they don't look like Pokémon, I was actually really excited for that very reason. Their designs look bizarre and alien, which really helps them stand out as invaders from another dimension. I also like that they give the Pokémon designers the ability to stretch out and make designs that never would have gotten into the games otherwise. I only have two problems with the Ultra Beasts. First, like every cool idea in the Pokémon series, they seem like a one-off. They were introduced in Generation 7, but so far Generation 8 has done nothing to expand on or develop the idea. My other complaint is that they introduced the coolest freaking design in all of Pokémon when they had Nihilego possess Lusamine, and they don't even let us catch it! Seriously, this thing is so rad, and it would possibly even be my favorite Pokémon of all time if they actually let us catch and use it. Why would you do this to me, Game Freak? The Ultra Beasts also tie into the final theme of these games, which is the theme of alternate dimensions and parallel universes. This is probably the generation that plays with these ideas the most, and they do it in a really cool way. However, I'm gonna save my discussion of those themes for a future video on the Pokemon multiverse. Now that we've talked about some of the major themes of this game and this region, let's talk about some of the major design trends and motifs. For this section, I'm actually going to be splitting these Pokemon into three categories: Alolan forms, regular Pokemon, and Ultra Beasts. First, let's start by looking at the Alolan forms. These Pokemon are really interesting from a design perspective because they give you a chance to see how Pokemon's design philosophy has changed since Generation 1 by comparing different designs for the same Pokemon. I think there are two main different ways that Game Freak made Alolan forms in this generation. The first is by softening the designs. You can see this in Pokemon like Alolan Raichu, Ninetales, and especially Persian, which are all smoother, rounder versions of their original forms. The second main way is by simply adding details, which can be seen with Alolan Dugtrio, Golem, Muck, and Marowak, which are all similar to their original forms, but with a few extra added doodads. I think these changes are pretty emblematic of the change in Pokemon design overall towards designs that are softer and rounder, but more detailed than in Generation 1. Moving on to the regular Pokemon of this generation, let's begin with the starters. Like the past few generations, each of the starters in this generation are based on a unified theme. In this case, some form of performers. Decidueye is based on an archer, specifically Robin Hood, but may also have been inspired by swashbuckling actors like Errol Flynn and Cary Elwes. Incineroar, the fire type, was based on a wrestler. While Pokemon has had a number of firefighting starter Pokemon, some players are confused why Incineroar isn't a firefighting, but rather a fire dark type. The reason is because Incineroar isn't just a wrestler, he's a heel who intentionally plays the villain. Finally, the water starter is Primarina. based on an opera singer. I named mine Melpomene. There are a few things that stand out to me about the design of Pokemon in this generation. The first is their color schemes. Gen 7 Pokemon tend to have very bright, saturated colors. Good examples include Crabrawler, Oranguru, Turtonator, Beware, Comfey, and Bruxish. Minior is an especially good example. While its outer shell is a subdued brown, inside it can be a wide array of bright colors. Another hallmark of this generation is its elaborate designs. These are designs that, while highly detailed, don't necessarily look cluttered. Examples include Golisopod, Como-O, Lurantis, Tapu Koko, and Lunala. All of these designs are far more complicated than anything you would see in the first few generations, but unlike generations 4 and 5, the details do not seem tacked on, but are rather an integrated part of the Pokemon's concept. In fact, there are almost no instances in this generation of random spots, rings, or stripes added to the Pokemon designs, and Rockruff is the only example I can think of a Pokemon with unnecessary spikes, something that used to be much more common in the designs. These are things that were present as recently as the previous generation. While not as egregious as generations 4 and 5, there were still plenty of Pokemon in Gen 6 with unnecessary design details, on Pokemon like Meowstic, Malamar, Barbaracle, and even Goodra. Instead, I like the way that many of the details are integrated into the concept of the Pokemon, but not in a way that's too on the nose. Examples include Rowlet's leafy bow tie, Gumshoe's jacket, Crabrawler's boxing gloves, or Salandit's bandana. Finally, let's talk about the Ultra Beasts. These designs are all very different, but the one thing they all have in common is that they intentionally break the rules of Pokemon design. Many of them, including Nihilego, Kartana, Xurkitree, and Blacephalon, have no obvious faces, something that is extremely rare among normal Pokemon. They may also be made of strange materials, such as paper for Kartana or glass for Nihilego, or they have a body plan that doesn't make sense, like Naganadel, Celesteela, or Guzzlord. They may also simply be unintuitive takes on unpleasant animals that Pokemon has avoided basing creatures off of, such as Buzzwole being a buff mosquito, or Pheromosa being an elegant cockroach princess. Also, while many of the regular Pokemon of this generation have elaborate designs, these Ultra Beasts are without a doubt the most elaborate. The other thing that they all have in common is that they're delightful and we need more of them, especially that Nihilego form. In terms of mechanical or technological improvements in this generation, there really isn't much to talk about. The flashy new battle mechanic of this generation is the Z move, enhanced new moves that can only be used once per battle. Because they're just upgraded moves, I don't really think that Z moves had any effect on the designs of the Pokemon in this generation. Similarly, I think we've reached the limits of the effects that technological improvements can have on the designs of these Pokemon. These games are not only running on the exact same hardware as the previous generation, but also using the exact same 3D models to represent the Pokemon. The first time that a new generation hasn't introduced new sprites or models. To be clear, I have absolutely no problem with Game Freak reusing models, as long as they don't lie about it, but it is a sign that further technological improvements are unlikely to expand the possibilities of Pokemon design. If there were any mechanical similarities that tied this generation together, I think it would be that this is a generation of gimmicks. Nearly every Pokemon in this generation has a gimmick, whether that be a unique typing, an exclusive special ability, or a unique move or Z-move. Great examples of this include Salazzle's unique Fire-Poison typing and Corrosion ability, Lycanroc's multiple forms, or Wishiwashi's Schooling ability. Other than Togedemaru being completely overshadowed by the far superior Pikachu imitation of Mimikyu, there are almost no Pokemon in this generation that can't claim something unique that helps them stand out from the crowd. But what do you think? Do you disagree with something that I said? Is there a major pattern or theme that I missed or got wrong? I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Pokemon of this generation in the comments down below. What's up, designers, and welcome back to Rempton Games. In today's episode of Evolution of Pokemon Design, we finally made it to the most recent generation, Generation 8, better known as Pokemon Sword and Shield. As always, we'll be looking at the common trends and motifs of these designs, how the themes and mechanics of this generation influence the Pokemon designs, and how the Pokemon of this generation differ from previous entries in the series. Without further ado, let's get started. Pokemon Sword and Shield take place in the Galar region, which is based on the island of Great Britain. Much like the past few generations, Generation 8 leans heavily into its geographic inspiration, and many Pokemon designs and concepts are influenced heavily by British culture and history. These include Corviknight, styled after a medieval knight, Yamper, based on the Queen of England's favorite dog, the Corgi, and Sinistea and Poltegeist for the British love of tea. Mr. Rhyme's appearance is based off of classic English actor Charlie Chaplin, and of course, Appleton was inspired by the well-known phrase, "as British as apple pie." This setting has also influenced the story of the games in a few major ways. Britain is famously in love with the sport of soccer, or football for those outside the US, and this obsession with organized sports is reflected in the way the Galar League is organized. In Galar, Pokemon battling is a spectator sport that takes place in huge stadiums full of screaming fans, and the gym leaders themselves are treated similarly to pro athletes. The backstory of the Galar region is also influenced by British history and legends, particularly those around King Arthur. The stories of the two kings who used the legendary sword and shield to fight against the darkest day is very similar to how King Arthur used the legendary sword Excalibur to unite the Kingdom of Great Britain and bring peace to the land.
Strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government.
Throughout the course of playing the game, the player character gets to retrace the steps of these legendary heroes and gets to prevent another Darkest Day event from happening with the help of the region's legendary Pokemon, Zacian and Zamazenta. Even the starter Pokemon of this region play into this theme, all being based on British entertainers or pop culture icons. Inteleon is based on the fictional British spy James Bond, Cinderace is based on a professional football player, and Rillaboom is based on a rock and roll drummer. In fact, rock music is somewhat of a sub-theme in this generation, with Toxtricity and Obstagoon also being based on rock musicians. The major mechanical change introduced in this generation is the introduction of Dynamax and Gigantamax Pokemon. These two forms are very similar to one another. They're both transformations that a Pokemon can undergo that make them appear to grow to gigantic sizes. For most Pokemon, Dynamax simply makes them bigger, but certain Pokemon take on a special form when they Dynamax, called a Gigantamax form. The concept of Dynamax Pokemon plays into what I was saying earlier about Pokemon battling being a spectator sport in the Galar region. Transforming your Pokemon into gigantic forms is a major spectacle, and throughout the game you're only allowed to do so in special locations called power spots. Most of these power spots are inside the gyms of the region, which were specifically built for Dynamax battles. The Gigantamax forms themselves are a varied bunch. Some Pokemon barely transform at all, while others change so completely that they barely resemble themselves. Despite this variety, there are a few interesting patterns to pick up. One pattern I picked up on was the difference between older Pokemon that were given Gigantamax forms and Gigantamax forms for Generation 8 Pokemon. For older Pokemon, Gigantamax forms tended not to change too much, and they mainly changed the Pokemon's design in two main ways. First, many of them gained glowy bits that emphasized their elemental nature, such as Charizard's flaming wings, Pikachu's electric tail, or Machamp's glowing fists. Second, and even more pervasive, was altering the Pokemon's design to emphasize a sense of scale. Meowth's design is stretched out to emphasize its height. Lapras's design shifts to evoke an entire cruise ship. Garbodor's garbage now includes entire buildings and vehicles, and Snorlax has an entire landscape growing on top of him. However, despite these adjustments, the Gigantamax forms stay pretty close to the Pokemon's original design. Not so with the Gen 8 Gigantamax designs. Many of these change the Pokemon's underlying design so much that they look more like actual evolutions than new forms. This can be seen most clearly with Pokemon like Melmetal, Sandaconda, Alcremie, Dreadnought, and Centiskorch. The reason these forms take more liberties with the original design is that they were probably developed at the same time, with each of the forms influencing the design of the other. While this can result in some very impressive looking Gigantamax designs, it also has a potential downside. Some Pokemon have very impressive Gigantamax forms that end up leaving their base forms feeling a bit plain and unfinished. It's possible that the designers wanted to save the more impressive looking designs for the Gigantamax forms, or maybe they wanted to make the base forms plainer for more of a contrast. It's also possible that none of this happened and that the more unfinished feeling designs are just part of a bigger trend in this generation. Since we've talked about G-Max designs, let's look more generally at the new Pokemon of this generation. In many ways, the designs of this generation harken back to Gen 1, with the simplicity of their color scheme and the wide variety of different types of monsters represented, including animalistic and humanoid, object-based Pokemon, Pokemon with multiple body segments, and even generically monstrous creatures. It also has some hallmarks of more recent gens, particularly in the variety of generally larger and rounder eyes, and the overall simplicity of the designs. While there are some relatively complex designs in the bunch, such as Dracozolt and Obstagoon, they're relatively few in this generation. However, I think there are two main traits that define the designs of this generation. The first is faithfulness to the source material, and the second is complexity of concept. Regarding the first point, there are many Pokemon in this generation that have designs that are extremely close to the object or animal that inspired them. Pokemon like Stonjourner, Sinistea, Centiskorch, Arrokuda, Dubwool, and Greedent are all very similar to their source material. While I rarely agree with comments saying that a Pokemon is just X or X with a face, I think it applies more to this generation than any other except the first. Add in the fact that many of these creatures are for animals that we've already seen, and in my opinion, a lot of these designs just end up feeling like plainer versions of Pokemon we've already seen. Just look at Emolga and Pachirisu versus Squovit and Greedent. They're all squirrels, but Pachirisu and Emolga are much more stylized and recognizable as Pokemon, whereas I could easily see Squovit and Greedent as characters in a Cartoon Network show about cartoon animals. You can similarly compare Wooloo and Dubwool with the Mareep family, or Thievul to Zoroark. Even Morpeko wouldn't look out of place in an episode of Hamtaro. Looking like a real-world animal or object isn't a bad thing on its own, I just feel like many of these Pokemon could use an extra twist to make them feel more distinct. Ironically, the other defining trait of this generation is complexity. Not of design, but of concept. Take the fossil Pokemon of this generation. Rather than simply being revived ancient Pokemon like every previous generation, instead, they're the mixed-up remains of multiple different fossils slammed together that harken back to real-world archaeological mix-ups. Similarly, Dragapult is an ancient ghostly salamander mixed with a modern stealth bomber that launches its young at its enemies, and Hatterene is a tiny telepathic alien piloting a suit made of hair. The stories and inspirations behind all of the Pokemon of this generation may not be obvious at first glance, but they usually include details that help tell more of the story, such as the oxidizing copper and history of colonialism implied by Copperage's design. If you want to design a Gen 8 Pokemon, you either need to try to squish 4 ideas into one design, or slap a face on Stonehenge and call it a day. In addition to brand new Pokemon in Gigantamax forms, Sword and Shield continued the trend started last generation by introducing new regional forms, called Galarian forms. These forms are similar to the Alolan forms I talked about last time, so I'm mainly going to focus on how they differ. The first difference is that these forms are no longer just for Generation 1 Pokemon. While most of the new forms are still for Gen 1 Pokemon, we also get new forms for Pokemon from Generations 2, 3, and 5. But none for Generation 4, which may be related to the remakes coming out later this year. Another difference is their evolutions. For the first time, regional forms can have different evolutions than their original forms. Galarian Meowth evolves into Berserker instead of Persian, and Galarian Corsola evolves into Cursula, even though Corsola originally didn't evolve at all. The final difference is in the design themselves. There are two main trends I notice with the design of Galarian forms. The first is a tendency towards darker and edgier versions of the original designs. This can be seen with Meowth, Corsola, Zigzagoon, Stunfisk, and the legendary birds. Another related trend is the relative lack of color. Many of these new forms tend to have a black, white, and grayscale color scheme with small pops of color. This applies to Weezing, Mr. Mime, Darmanitan, and Yamask. Finally, let's talk about the legendary Pokemon of this generation. To be honest, I found most of the legendary Pokemon in these games to be pretty lackluster, with one big exception. To me, most of them just don't really feel legendary for one reason or another. Let's start with Zacian and Zamazenta, the faces of Sword and Shield. Nothing about these Pokemon really feels legendary to me. Their designs, while highly complex like most legendaries, especially in their equipped forms, just don't inspire awe the same way something like Kyogre, Zekrom, or Solgaleo does. Their backstory also doesn't feel that legendary. Their main claim to fame is that they've fought in many battles. Compare that to Regigigas pulling continents into place, or Xerneas being an embodiment of life energy, and it pales in comparison. I could say similar things about Cubfu and Urshifu, Glastrier and Spectrier, and Zarude. I have a hard time seeing why any of these Pokemon are legendary, and I think if you plop them into any of the recent generations as a normal non-legendary Pokemon, nobody would blink an eye. The one major exception to this trend is Eternatus. Eternatus is absolutely buck wild, and while it took me some time to warm up to it, I absolutely love it now. When I first saw it in-game, I'm pretty sure I said out loud, "What the heck is that?" Because its complex, skeletal, otherworldly design seems so out of place with the other Pokemon of this generation. However, it immediately looked powerful and intimidating, and the boss fight against Eternamax Eternatus is easily the most memorable moment in the entire game. While I was a little disappointed that they didn't introduce any new Ultra Beasts in this generation, Eternatus is very much in line with what I would expect a legendary Ultra Beast to look like. That's all I have for this week. I would love to hear your thoughts about this video and these Pokemon in the comments down below. Let me know if you agree or disagree with the comments that I made, and if there are any major trends or topics that you think I missed. If you like this video, give it a like, and if you haven't checked out the previous entries in this series, you should definitely give those a watch as well. Until then, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.